Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm going to be taking a look at the full speed Toothpick Pro. Now I know this guy has been out for a while, so apologies for not checking it out earlier. The toothpick thing started off as an endeavour by Bob, or Kebab FPV, and he probably doesn't remember this, but some time ago he sent me a message saying, hey, you've always done a lot of stuff with micros, check out what I'm working on. And I've always been a big fan of Bob. I've built a couple of the floss models, one of which I did as a build video on the channel, and he's a dentist, so that's where the name of his toothpick and floss frame comes from. At the same time, Full Speed are pioneers in the lightweight brushless micro world. I mean, when the Leader 120 came out, it was fast, light and very affordable. You just had to up the digital idle speed, otherwise you would get a death roll. But anyways, from there Full Speed have continued to innovate, and I think other than the props, pretty much every component on their models is their own design. So this is why I don't get copying the name of the toothpick, because for me it's the name of a different product and it's not a genre. It would be like Honda calling their Civic the Honda Ford Focus or something like that. Now I totally get Bob allowing it from his perspective. I mean, you can't say the word toothpick now in the hobby without thinking about him, and I do exactly the same. But if you are going to make a genre out of it, then you need to stick to the guidelines of that genre, which to me is a 2 to 3S ultralight brushless model with an all-up weight of around about 70 to 80 grams maximum. And for me, the Toothpick Pro breaks all of those guidelines. From day one, I've always called these types of models micros, and from there I'd either say it's a 1S or a 2S brushed micro, and when the motors went brushless, I'd do the same but then mention the prop size, so 2-inch, 2.5 inch, and then 3 inch is where I think it stops, because any bigger than 3 inch and it's hard to get under 250 grams. So to me, the Full Speed Toothpick Pro is a 2.5 inch 4S brushless micro, and other than the 16x16 stack, it's not doing anything different than the 2.5 inch models from maybe a year ago. I just think that Full Speed are more creative than taking someone else's product name. I mean, the Leader 120 was called the Leader because at the time it was the leader. I think in one of my videos I jokingly said that perhaps now these models do have the ability to be even lighter due to the all-in-one boards and the 16x16 stacks, coupled with the tiny brushless motors and nano CMOS cameras, that maybe they do need their own genre. And I think I said I'd either call them the ultralight micro class or the twig class, because that's what they look like to me, thinking no one would ever pay attention. But how wrong was I when I received an email about a frame called the Speed Racer Twig by Racer X FPV, which I'm told came from my idea. And now Ishin, of course, has copied it like they do everything else. So maybe there is something with this twig name, I don't know. Anyways, as I said, this Toothpick Pro does break the toothpick checkboxes, but that doesn't mean it still can't be a good model. So its dry weight without a battery is 70 grams. They recommend a 350 milliamp to 550 milliamp 4S, but I'll tell you now, don't go any lower than a 550 milliamp 4S. I tried a 450 milliamp 4S and the voltage sagged instantly and gave a sub 3-minute flight time. And don't be fooled by the lighter Whoop style 520 milliamp GMB LiPo either, just because it's 17 grams lighter than this one. There is no such thing as free weight when it comes to LiPos. If it's lighter, then it's either labeled wrong, or in GMB's case, Whoop LiPos don't require the amp draw of an 1106 motor running a 2.5 inch prop, so the C rating is probably much lower, and a lower C rating will result in a lighter battery, which means if you use it on this model, it's not going to provide as much current as the 550 milliamp LiPo, and you will get more voltage sag on punch outs. So with the 550 milliamp 4S, it weighs 140 grams, which isn't much different than many of the other 2.5 inch models from maybe a year ago. It's almost like they are trying to reinvent the 2.5 inch class by calling it something else. The frame is thicker at 2.5 millimeters, but the design is similar to the non-Pro version. Again, they have gone with the battery strap feeding underneath the frame. I guess they don't have a choice because the VTX stops it from running through the stack. However, this time it did come with some foam, which I haven't used. You see, the problem with running the battery strap like this is that the LiPo is lifted below the frame. So if you crash, there is nothing stopping it sliding out of the strap and potentially disconnecting from the model. But at the same time, foam doesn't do the job either. There needs to be some tension there, so I've added some 3M silicone strips to mine to stop that from happening. They give you two battery straps. One is too long for the recommended LiPos and the other is too short, so I've just chopped off some length of the longest one. They have also provided some magic tape for the motor wires, but they are pretty neatly laid down in the first place, so I haven't used it. As I mentioned earlier, the motors are an 1106 4500 kV with a naked bottom, which again breaks the rules of the toothpick genre, but I should stop going on about these rules because they've made their choice with the name and they are a good quality motor. I think I would have perhaps called it the Leader Light and the non-Pro version the Leader Ultralight. Or what about the BAT 100 V2? Remember that one from Full Speed? But hey, what's it got to do with me? The props are the King Kong 2535 quad blades, which are just a little bit meh for me. They are cheap, so that's why they aren't HQ props, and you are given a full spare set of props as well as 2 extra. You do have to fit them yourself, so they come with a load of 1.5mm hex screws, and I had one of those screws left over. It's important to note that this one came set up with the props running out, so check that in Betaflight before putting them on, but I'm sure that they will stick to that configuration. From here, everything else is the same component-wise compared to the non-Pro version. So it's got their switching VTX via the Tramp protocol up to 500 milliwatts. It comes locked out of the box to 25 milliwatts, so you have to hold down the button at the back while powering the model on and then count for about 20 seconds. You can then let go of the button and the LEDs on the VTX will flash a few times like they're excited that you've unlocked it. Above the VTX are the same 12 amp BL Heli S 4-in-1 ESCs, except this time they have done away with the JST connectors and directly soldered the motor wires to them. I think this is a good move because on the original the connectors bend so easy and they're also in the firing line of a crash. They have also added a 25 volt 470 microfarad external capacitor. This is a good move when going up in voltage as the back EMF caused from the ESCs increases when you up the voltage, so a capacitor should smooth that out if they've used a decent one. Then at the top is Full Speed's own flight controller, and this time it's come flashed with Betaflight version 4.02. The canopy and camera hasn't changed, which is a shame because the Cadex Turbo F2 is a CMOS camera, and the only thing fixing it down at the front is a single screw. Now, I made a video why we get Jello in our video feed with CMOS cameras, so I'll put a card up in the top right for that, but in short, the way that I can just move this whole camera and canopy around is why it's not going to give good results. And I said this in my review of the non-Pro version, they haven't used a nano camera, they've used a micro camera. So if they wanted to mount a camera using TPU, then they needed to use a CCD camera. If you watch my video on Jello, you will understand why. But I also understand why they are using this camera. It's cheap and I'm not a big fan of it. Pretty much every single one I've flown has dust on the sensor and a big line along the bottom of the screen. I do like how the linear antenna mounts to the canopy though. This is the FR Sky version, which runs in D8 mode. I personally wouldn't get this version because the range is really poor. They do a Crossfire version and also a no RX version, so you can add any receiver that you like to this model. I think some of the range issues with the D8 receiver is to do with how they are mounting it. I noticed that when I flew the non-pro version, that I got more range in one direction than in the other direction. So I think the antenna needs to be coming out of the top of the canopy rather than to one side, because it's clearly benefiting in one direction than the other when it comes to range. And we have that powerful VTX, so it needs something doing, that's for sure. Now, Full Speed aren't really into freestyle, hence the name. In their videos, I've only ever seen them racing around multi-story car parks. So in Betaflight, the digital idle speed was set to 3%, which will almost certainly result in a death roll. 5.5% seems to do the trick. They never enable air mode, which again says to me they're not flying freestyle. If you don't enable air mode, at 0 throttle, the model will act as if it's falling out of the sky when you do a roll or a flip. So I enabled that. RX Lost wasn't set, but RX Set was, so I've changed that just in case I get a failsafe and I need to find the model. We are going to get some voltage sag with this guy, so I like to set my power and battery both to 3.3 volts per cell, because the constant flashing in the on-screen display on a punch out is really annoying. It's going to do it anyways, but it's going to do it less with this set to a lower value. And for some reason they had the current meter set to a warning at 300 milliamps. First of all, I think that would only work if the model had a physical beeper, which it doesn't. And second of all, I don't think this guy has got a current meter anyways, so I'm not sure why that option is there. So I've changed it to 0. They have their own PIDs and rates, so I didn't touch those. The receiver's channel map was set up for AETR, and I run TAER, so I had to change that. The RSSI is set to the auxiliary 5, which is correct for the D8 receiver that this model has come with. And I've added some RC deadband in there to stop my transmitter's trim drifting. The modes tab just had ARM on the auxiliary 1 in the backwards position. I've got a feeling that Full Speed are using Spectrum or Futaba or something like that, so I switched that out to suit my Tyrannus. There was no angle mode in there at all, so I set that up on the auxiliary 2. Beeper was set up, but on auxiliary 2, so I had to change that to auxiliary 3. Flip over after crash was selected on the auxiliary 3, so I changed that to auxiliary 4, but again, it was set in the back position. Now, first of all, this isn't a model I'd really use the flip over after crash function on, also known as turtle mode, because its props could get caught in the grass, so when you try to use it, the motors will be stuck, and that will put pressure on the ESCs and could cause the ESCs to blow. Second of all, having the mode in the back position is a really bad thing for beginners, especially if they're starting out with an FR Sky transmitter. The amount of questions I get saying that my quad has got no throttle, but it pitches and it rolls, and the problem is always caused by turtle mode being active, whether it's set in the back position or the user hasn't set up turtle mode, but it's actually in Betaflight and sitting on that PWM value. So I wouldn't recommend it. The on-screen display was set up okay. I turned the warnings off and I added the VTX channel because it's using the tramp protocol and I fly with other people. This is just a quick line of sight video so that we can see what the punch out is like. So let's go for that. Yep, it's got loads of power and it disappears very quickly. Didn't hear any oscillations.
but sometimes you don't hear oscillations when flying line of sight because you're not really flying forward and doing sharp turns. This thing is just so tiny. Not very loud either. That's something else that I like to do with these line of sight videos. So this is the same 550 milliamp 4S GMB LiPo you saw earlier. Not loud at all. And the camera on my head's got a limiter on it, so they all sound the same. Yeah, I mean, not a massive fan of these props. Would probably suggest going with the Gemfan 2.5 inch props. I think they'd be less demanding as well. Might get less performance, but more flight time. Maybe a smoother flight and easier to tune from what I can remember from these props on previous models. But line of sight, so far, so good.
So here is some DVR footage, and just as I predicted earlier in the video, on a sunny day you will get a fair amount of jello through your FPV feed. Annoyingly, it's probably not going to show up from the DVR footage, but also, as I predicted, there are blobs of dust everywhere on the sensor, and when you crash, more seem to get added to it, so it's like there is dust in the camera waiting to be flung at the sensor. It does fly really nice though, with just a couple of what appear to be prop wash oscillations, although sometimes it's hard to tell if you are getting a prop wash oscillation or it's just the camera moving around in high G maneuvers. You can't audibly hear prop wash oscillations, and as you saw earlier, how the camera moves around just by moving it with my hand, that it could be that. So, like I say, if I bought this model, I'd stick a CCD micro camera in there. One thing I did notice, which I forgot to test in the line of sight flight, is that I was getting a lot of drift in angle mode, which now explains why they didn't add it in Betaflight as a mode. So, if you are learning or using angle mode for whatever reason, then this one isn't for you. But if you have already bought this model and are trying to fix the angle drift issue, I noticed that in Betaflight, without being armed, the model's accelerometer was drifting in the graphic. So to me, that's an electrical noise issue interfering with the flight controller. So I would start by replacing that capacitor on the battery terminals for a better brand. I kind of hinted earlier in the video that you need a good low ESR capacitor for it to be effective in filtering out noise, and that's because I hadn't heard of the brand that they have used on this model. I personally exclusively use Panasonic or Rubicon capacitors because I've actually used off-brand low ESR capacitors in the past because they were cheap and they actually made the problems worse. You do have to be careful though, because there are a lot of fake Panasonic and Rubicon capacitors out there, so make sure that you buy them from a reputable source, for example, not eBay. If that doesn't work, then the flight controller isn't soft mounted, but I'd be surprised if that is the problem, given that I can see it drifting in Betaflight without the motors armed or it flying. Other than that, with my recommended LiPo, you get shy of just a 5-minute flight time and around about 4 minutes, giving it death. So I'm going to leave you with some footage of this guy at a different location where I can stretch its legs a little more, and I'll put a link in the description if you wish to buy one. You know, I get asked all of the time in the comments, should I buy this one or should I buy such and such? And for me, this model isn't in the Toothpick Toothpick class. It's in the 2.5 inch brushless micro class, which I'm not really a big fan of. I either prefer the Toothpick class for locations like this or a powerful 3-inch model. And when it comes to toothpicks or ultralight micros or twigs or whatever you want to call them, the GEP-RC Phantom is the closest that I've seen to what I would build so far, especially with it being a top mount for freestyle. I'm hopefully going to get to try this twig model out, which looks really promising, but until then, I think I'd say build your own until further notice. So, as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.